evening, everybody. I'm Shadi Bartsch-Zimmer, the director of the Stefanovich Institute on the Formation of Knowledge, and I am delighted to welcome you here this evening for the second conversation in the series, A Meeting of the Minds. A Meeting of the Minds is jointly sponsored by the Institute and the Booth School of Business. Once a quarter, we bring together a faculty member from Booth and one from the humanistic fields, including law, religion, and psychology, to have a moderated discussion around a topic that we feel is of interest to our society at large. Our goal in doing this is to reveal the symbiotic relationship between business and culture by engaging in thoughtful, perhaps provocative, unscripted conversations. And of course, we invite the public to participate so that we can extend the conversation beyond what we say to each other on campus. Although, to tell you the truth, business and the humanities do not that often talk to each other on campus. In helping to organize such interactions, the Stefanovich Institute is carrying out one of our central missions. We consistently aim to leverage the intellectual resources at the University of Chicago to put different fields of knowledge into dialogue with each other, because we believe that what comes out of such interactions can result in entirely new ways for us to understand the world around us. And my favorite example of this is when psychology and economics got married and produced behavioral economics as their offspring, which is now, of course, a fully recognized field. The Booth School of Business has been most generous in supporting this enterprise, and its faculty have likewise taken up the challenge with gusto. I am grateful to both. I would also like to thank my co-planner, Austin Goolsby, and Jane Rodriguez and McCall Serda for their seamless organization of these events. Tonight's conversation will feature Ayelet Fishbach, the Jeffrey Breckinridge Keller Professor of Behavioral Science and Marketing at Chicago Booth, and Agnes Callard, Associate Professor in Philosophy at the University of Chicago. The conversation will be moderated by the New York Times columnist and best-selling author, David Brooks. Mr. Brooks is currently a commentator on the PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. His most recent book, The Second Mountain, was released in 2019. He is also the author of The Road to Character, Bobos in Paradise, and The Social Animal, The Hidden Sources of Love, Character, and Achievement. He's on the faculty of Yale University and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And of course, given all these accolades, he got his BA from the University of Chicago. I'd also like to briefly introduce our two wonderful interlocutors from the university. Agnes Callard is an associate professor in philosophy. She too received her BA from the University of Chicago in 1997 and her PhD from Berkeley in 2008. Her primary areas of specialization are ancient philosophy and ethics, which she manages to make exciting, lively, and relevant even to the most blasé of undergraduates. Professor Callard recently published a monograph called Aspiration, about how it is we can make decisions or aspire to goals without knowing what the final outcome will feel like. For example, deciding to have children. Among her articles, the one I'm particularly eager to read is titled The Reason to be Angry Forever, forthcoming in the Moral Psychology of Anger. Professor Callard has contributed many other articles to journals of philosophy and ethics, produces a monthly column for The Point magazine, and has written for the New York Times. Our second interlocutor is Professor Ayelet Fishbach from the Booth School of Business. Professor Fishbach earned her BA and her PhD magna cum laude in psychology in 1992 and 1999 respectively, both from the University of Tel Aviv. She joined the Chicago Booth faculty in 2002. Professor Fishbach studies social psychology, management, and consumer behavior. In particular, she's an expert on motivation and decision-making, and she's published in many psychology and marketing journals, including the Journal of Consumer Research, the Journal of Marketing Research, Psychological Science, and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Her research is regularly featured in the media, including the Wall Street Journal, CNN, the Tribune, NPR, and the New York Times annual Years in Ideas. Professor Fishbach is also the recipient of several international awards, and here I especially want to mention her award in 2018 from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology. The award is entitled the Career Trajectory Award for scholars at the peak of their career. So we are getting Professor Fishbach at the peak of her career. She has also won awards from the Fulbright Educational Foundation and, of course, teaching awards from the University of Chicago. So here you have it, two very different perspectives, perhaps, on the issues of motivation and aspiration, from somebody who works in marketing and somebody who works in ancient philosophy. Tonight's topic will focus on these questions in particular. How do people motivate themselves to achieve their goals? What does it mean to transform yourself into the person you'd like to be? What is the process of self-transformation, and what are the common barriers to self-transformation? As usual, we will have 55 minutes of conversation, followed by 30 minutes of audience questions and comments. Please welcome Professor Fishbach, Professor Callard, and Mr. Brooks, Dr. Brooks, I should say, to whom I will now hand the reins. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadi. It's a pleasure to be back here for me. When I graduated in 1983, I couldn't wait to get out of here. And now I can't wait to get back. I'm one of those people who realized how much the University of Chicago gave me. I realize it more with every successive year. And I feel closer to the school now than I ever did. I had a very studious career when I was an undergrad. I had a double major in history and celibacy. And I really took to the Chicago form. And you know, one of a classmate said, one of the great things Chicago gave me was enthusiasm for learning. There's a saying, if you burn with enthusiasm, people will come for miles to watch you burn. And my professors had that. They really looked at the great books and read them as if the keys to the kingdom, the keys to the secret of life, were found in these books if you read them well and studied them. And once you've tasted that wine, you can't go back to just, Diet Coke. And so it's fed a permanent dissatisfaction in my life. And so it's a treasure for me to talk to a philosopher and a psychologist a little about that dissatisfaction, about personal transformation, about personal growth, and how lives happen and how we either control or don't. I thought we'd start, and I want to pick up right away that we've got people with two different disciplines coming at the same sorts of issues. And so I thought we'd start with one discrete topic and to see how you both approach the topic differently. And that topic is advice. Now, I'm a columnist. That's what I do. I give advice. And at my classes, I give a lot of advice. My students call my course Therapy with Brooks, because I pass along advice I've heard. And I think it's really useful to give advice because it feels so good for me to give it. And so one bit of advice I always pass to my students on how to do marriage or how to deal with a relationship. And I got this off the internet, so it must be good. It was, they say you should never go to bed mad at your spouse. And she said, sometimes just go to bed. You'll wake up in the morning, you'll feel better. Just go to bed. So that seemed to be very wise advice. The other bit of advice, she said, if you're a wife and you're really mad at your husband, you feel inclined to bitch about him to somebody's mom, bitch to his mom and not yours. His mom will forgive him, yours never will. So these seem discreetly good advice. So Agnes, we'll start with you. How do you think about advice? What's good advice? What's bad advice? And
If you have my mom, you should not bitch to her, definitely.
So I don't believe in advice. So we disagree. So I'm a philosopher, and the first thing I do is make a bunch of distinctions. Okay, so let me distinguish advice from two other advice-like things. One of them is going to be, we'll call it instruction, right? So what I mean by instruction is, suppose that there's something I want to do, right? Like get my copier to work or get across town or whatever, and I'm like, how do I do that, right? And you're like, oh, take this bus, or oh, just press that button. I'll call that instruction, right? So in the case of instruction, like I have this pretty concrete goal, right? And someone just might have the relevant information about how do I get to that goal. I would say that's not advice. Okay, that's perfectly possible. And the other thing I want to distinguish from advice is something like mentoring or training, where you have a kind of close personal relationship with the person that you're interacting with, and so you can kind of key them into what will work for them because you understand their psychology, you understand what they want, you understand that, like, in their case, the thing to say is it's okay to go to bed angry because of the way they work and the way their marriage works. Right? So I think that I also would say that's not advice. I'll call it like mentoring or something like that. So what I want, the dream, I think, about advice is that we can sort of be totally hands-off with someone and yet still help them in a substantive way, right? And I think you can't do that. It's sort of like cheap talk. Like you can say things that make you feel good as they make you feel like you're wise. So I think people love to give advice because like you feel like you know so much, right? And in particular, people who have succeeded in life, like you, are often asked to give advice as though you know how to succeed. But of course, you only did it one time, right? You don't have like empirical evidence of like trying in a bunch of different ways so that you know how to succeed. You just know one particular path that you took, right? It's not a good basis for knowledge. So I think mostly it's like it makes us feel as though the process by which we got to where we are now was one where we like knew all along. But that's kind of an illusion. It's kind of like a retrospective story that we tell. So I guess I would say I'm pretty skeptical of advice if we are clear in restricting advice in the way that I just did.
So Agnes, as a philosopher, started with distinctions. I start with data. Okay? And so I give people advice. I also ask them to give me back advice. And then I see what's more motivating for them, what gets them to act. And we did this with quite a few groups. We started with kids in middle school. Okay? These were kids that were struggling with doing their homework, and we offered advice to half of them. The other half, we asked them, how about you give advice to another kid that's struggling with doing their homework? And then we just observed like, who's doing their homework more. Turned out that those that were giving advice were doing their homework for more hours than those that were getting advice. So maybe it's about kids, and so we go to adults. We ask unemployed people how to get a job. What do you do to get a job? And when you ask someone who's unemployed to give you advice on how to get a job, the first thing that they say is, what do I know? And then you say, okay, but just tell me, what do you know? Turn out that they know quite a lot. Turn out that also once they give advice, they are more motivated to seek a job than after they get the advice that we were able to give them, which we were trying to give good advice. We went to overweight individuals, again, asked them either to give advice or gave them advice. They were more motivated by giving advice than by getting advice. We did this in a few other populations. One that was interesting was people that were admitting to having struggles with anger management. So angry people, basically, if they give you advice how to relax, they're more relaxed than if you give them advice how to do that. By the end of the day, I think that I might be closer to you than I figure out when you started. I think that giving advice is very useful. Getting advice, less.
Now, why is that? I mean, is it because the advice is stupid, or else people can't follow through on the advice because the problem is one of motivation and not information?
Because people already know what to do. Because most of the time, most of the advice that we give people, they already know what to do. If you are giving someone who's struggling with their weight advice what to do, they know. Okay? They know exactly what they're supposed to eat. They know that they should exercise. The problem is motivational. It's not with the knowledge. And again, I hate to agree with you. I think that we are supposed to debate. But if the problem is not knowledge, is motivating yourself, then you can get your inner strength by thinking about what you know, by thinking about what you can do to help yourself more than by listening to me telling you that the things that you already know.
I have to say, I didn't know about any of Ayelet's research when I came to my conclusions, and I'm very proud that I got to them without any consideration of the data. So it's a confirmation. I actually do think that sometimes other people know things that you don't know, and they can help you. It's just that I think that usually you need some personal connection in order for that to sort of work, in order for them to see what they have to supply you, what you need from them. Like the sort of context in which we usually give advice, there's such a space between the two people that kind of, I think the kind of the connection that would allow for the flow of useful information isn't there. That's my hypothesis that's based on no empirical evidence.
Yeah. We're going to see this distinction through the night, the data distinctions, and I'm a journalist, so I just do random ass stuff that seems interesting. Let's talk about motivation, because we've spent the last 30 years with this cognitive revolution, Kahneman and Thaler and all these people really understanding decision-making processes and bias and heuristics. But it seems to me we've barely passed beyond St. Augustine in understanding our desires and where our desires come from. So I can choose to order broccoli or not, but I can't choose to like broccoli. And so there are these distinct motivational states that drive us, and they well up somewhere deep inside. And so how do we think about that? Maybe I'll start with Ayelet. How do we think about motivations and how they're lit, destroyed, buried, or inflamed?
First, we've been thinking about motivation for a while. Empirically, we started seriously thinking about motivation with Walter Mischel studies on delayed gratification. Thaler, who definitely made his mark studying decision-making, was writing about the planner and the doer, and that's a self-control conflict. Okay? The doer is the person in you that does stuff, and the planner is the person who tells the doer, don't do it. Okay? So there is a self-control conflict. We've been thinking about motivation, yet there is a lot to do. There is many things that we are discovering now, how to think about motivation, how to think about motivating yourself. You were raising, for example, the healthy eating problem. How do we get ourselves to eat more healthily? My research suggests that using intrinsic motivation is the way to go, so just don't eat broccoli. Okay, but find the healthy food that you enjoy eating, because we find that what predicts healthy diet is one's ability to find the food that they like eating. What predicts adhering to New Year resolutions is your ability to find resolutions that you like pursuing. So intrinsic motivation, and we can define it later, intrinsic motivation matters quite a bit for motivation. We find that being in a certain social environment, certain people support your motivation. So designing an environment such that you are with people that support your goals matters. We look at how people manage multiple goals. We look at how people sustain their motivation by thinking about what they've completed thus far versus what is yet to do. We think a lot about motivation.
But what you just said, I mean, St. Augustine said that 1,600 years ago, to replace a lower love with a higher love, and don't try to crush a love. I want to know where my dislike of broccoli comes from. Like, why is some students are just tremendously driven in philosophy and some are not. And you use the phrase intrinsic motivation, but that's a phrase that doesn't, I want to know what that means. Like, what's intrinsic? Where is the intrinsic field?
what it means to be intrinsically motivated is to feel that you're doing something for the sake of doing it. Okay? And in the extreme sense, that rarely happens. Okay? So it's hard to think about a job or studying philosophy as extremely intrinsically motivated in the sense that all the benefits are from doing it. There are usually also benefits from completing it. Okay? You will get a degree from the University of Chicago. Yeah. Okay? Right. But people vary in how intrinsically motivated they are. That is, how much I get benefits from doing it as opposed to only from completing it. And this variation matters. Okay? The person who gets benefits from doing the thing while they're doing it is going to stick with it longer. Immediate rewards really help sustain the motivation. Okay? If it feels good at the moment, someone will be able to do it. I have to use data, okay, so I will mention one piece of data. We went to the University of Chicago, to the library, and basically asked people, students as they're entering the library, how much they enjoy whatever they are going to study, and we also asked them to text us when they are done studying that. Oh, we asked another question, how important it is what they are going to study. Okay, so it's how important, how enjoyable, and then just send us a text when you're done. And it turned out that what predicts how much time a student spends in the library is how much they enjoy the materials that they are studying. How important the materials are for them did not predict the time that they spend in the library at all. Okay, that was not significant. And for me, that's a pretty strong evidence that the good student is the student that was able to get the immediate benefit from that was able to find interest and enjoyment in what they are studying.
Okay, Agnes, there's a famous, I think it was Plato, could have been Aristotle. It's been a long time. Passions are like horses, and the reason is a charioteer.
Plato.
It's Plato. Mm-hmm. See, I knew it was one of those two. Now, what Ayelet is saying describes that that's probably not the right model, that we trust the charioteer. Maybe it's better to try to educate the horses a little better. What do you think about that, just that charioteer model of how life works, where you have this very smart brain up here and it's controlling our desires and letting out the sluice gates when it wants to and tamping them back down?
Well, in Plato's story, the control thing doesn't work out so well. The horses can easily kind of go nuts. So Plato was aware of that problem. I guess I think it matters a lot when you're talking about someone's desiring something. It matters a lot whether you're talking about sort of the beginning, the middle, or the end of a certain story. So, you know, if we talk about you and how you don't like broccoli, and like, I guess that's, you know, probably that's the way it's going to be for you. But my kids, like, if they are like, you know, 2 or 3 and they only want to eat beige things, that's not okay, right? I have to get them to like some of the things that they don't like. They might not immediately take any intrinsic, you know, pleasure in eating vegetables. So I just say, okay, no dessert if you don't eat your vegetables, or whatever, right? Whatever works that night. And so I think there's a kind of longer process that we go through. So if you think about the things that you enjoy, like that you desire to do, right? Like I get intrinsic pleasure out of like talking in front of an audience like this, okay? This is fun for me. I like it, right? But I didn't always like it. Like, I used to be scared of it. And I get intrinsic pleasure out of reading Plato and out of a lot of things, even out of like conversations with certain people that I did. My best friend, I did not like her when we first met. We hated each other. We thought we would never be friends. And we became friends, right? So those are cases where my intrinsic motivations change over time. And so part of what I want to do is understand, how do these intrinsic motivations come into being, right? Because they don't just well up. We're not just saddled with them. It's not just like I accidentally happen to end up with a desire to speak in front of people, right? The things that I did in my life leading up to this moment are relevant to the story of how I ended up with this desire. And so what I look at in my book is like, how can we tell that story in a way that is sensitive both to the importance of sort of environmental facts, like that I happen to be, you know, ended up in a high school debate class, and I enjoyed doing debate, and I failed at it. I lost mostly. I wasn't a good debater, but I liked it. And that, that's the fact that my school had a high school debate team is relevant, right, to my enjoying speaking in front of people. But it's not like, oh, well, you just throw someone in a high school debate thing and then out pops me, right? There was something I was doing over the many years, say, between high school and now, where the way I think about it is there was a value that I was trying to get into view, right? And at first, that value took a funny form. Like, it took the form of, I want to win this competition with this person. I want the judge to think I'm smarter than them, right? And that's not like a great motivation for like wanting to speak in front of people. It's not perfect, but it's also not that bad. Like, it's a start, right? So, and you might start, we start in not the same place where we finish. So my kid might start with eating broccoli because he wants dessert, right? That is why my 6-year-old eats broccoli. But that's not why my 15-year-old eats broccoli. He actually likes broccoli. So I think that we can have this sense that there is more out there to value than what we currently value. And we can sort of work towards it with kind of environmental assistance, right? And I think in terms of the students, like, I think the way I prefer to think about it, Shadi described like the most blasé student, but I actually don't have a lot of those. Like, my students, I've never met a student who was totally blasé, let's say. And some of them might be more excited than others, but I think of that as them being further or less far along in this process, right? They haven't gotten the value as squarely into view as the others. And so the question is just sort of, how do you help people? How do you move them along so that they can get it better into view, so that they can be more intrinsically motivated? Yeah.
So the data is that it's a really bad idea to tell your kid that they will get dessert if they eat the broccoli. It might work for studying philosophy, okay, and public speaking, but we've done some study many years ago that basically if you add any instrumental benefits for eating veggies, for eating healthy food, that makes kids hate it. Just this month, a much larger scale study came out showing that that's the same for college students. If you're trying to add these instrumental benefits to healthy foods, they don't like it. Okay? We don't like to eat for instrumental benefits. We like to eat because it tastes good, and so just
But so I have some more data for you, which is that
Yeah.
I did that with my oldest kid, and it worked. So, I guess one thing here is like with kids, there's a question: do you get them to put it in their mouth or not? Right? It's not about why they're putting it in their mouth. It's like, what will they put in their mouth? And it can be hard to get them to even try something, right? And so I think you're right that the fact that they're eating it to get dessert, that's not going to make them enjoy it. It might make them enjoy it less, right? But it might make them put it in their mouth. And like my view is like, if you can get them to do that a bunch of times, they kind of get used to it, so at least it doesn't seem gross to them. Yeah. Anyway, that's mine.
There certainly is research that if you pay kids to read books, they read less because of the extrinsic. Let me ask you about a specific kind of desire which you write about, which is aspiration, which is sort of a moral desire. And so most of us want to lead a really good life. And some people go to extremes to lead because their aspirational sense is so incredibly powerful. I have this little project called Weave where I go look at community builders around the country. And so we go to Englewood and other neighborhoods like that. And we find people who have lived lives of radical self-denial because they just want to feel right with the world. And so how do you think about that moral motivation and how it arises and what its nature is?
Yeah. So I actually think of aspiration more broadly than just the moral. So I think aspiration covers all cases in which you're trying to come to value something that you don't yet value. So if I'm trying to come to value classical music, I count that as aspiration. Okay? If I'm trying to value reading Plato, that's aspiration. But also, if I'm trying to come to value being more public spirited or even self-denial, that's also aspiration. So they're all aspiration. Now, I guess I think that you could be asking two different questions about these cases of self-denial. So one thing you could be saying is, how do people come to be that way? How do people come to have that as a valuational target, right? And it can be quite mysterious to those of us who don't have it as a target, extreme self-denial, right? How that even shows up. And then the other is you might see them as especially aspirational people, like sort of full stop. And I guess I think I wouldn't take the second view. That is, you might think, suppose you just think you really understand why self-denial is so important and so good. You fully get that, and you've just devoted yourself to self-denial. Well, then you're not an aspirant, in my view. You're better than an aspirant in the sense that you've arrived at your destination, right? So the point isn't to always be traveling. The point is to, at some point, arrive at the value destination. So those people have arrived at the value destination of a certain kind of public spiritedness, self-denial, et cetera. So I would say, in a way, they're not somehow paradigmatically aspirational. They were, probably. Now the question is, like, how do you get that as a target? How do you aspire to that? And I think I do think environmental considerations are very relevant to like what targets show up for you. You know, having certain kinds of music even in the background when you're a kid, like, can be part of what sets those things up as possible targets for aspiration for you. But I actually think it would be an empirical question to ask what sets that up as a possible target for someone's aspiration, and I don't take myself to my answer to it.
Do you have the psychology give us tools here to?
Yeah, so as a psychologist, we actually think about the level of aspiration, which could be similar to what you mean by target. Okay, so you have a goal, you want to listen, you want to play music, and then you can have different level of aspirations. Okay, you might want to just be able to play a few notes on the piano, or perform, or be great. You want to get a job, or you want to excel at it. What is your level of aspiration within a specific goal that you decided to pursue? And then as psychologists, we think about what determines people's level of aspiration and how we can influence that. And so we study interventions such as what kind of feedback makes someone develop higher level of aspirations. To give you an example, we do a study where we either give people feedback on what they have accomplished before or what's yet to accomplish. And what we find is that if we highlight what's ahead of you, the remaining action, then people develop higher level of aspiration. Okay? Thinking about everything that I can still do is pushing you forward. One intervention that can increase level of aspiration.
What about exemplars that there's a Spartan educator who said, I make honorable things excellent to children. And so holding up a high standard of what a model life should be, does that work, or does that people say, I can never do that?
My answer is not going to be very satisfying. It's going to be in between. So it has to be something that's high, but not so high so that you're going to say, well, I can't do that. Okay. That's too extreme. Right. We would like goals or targets to be just above what you can easily get to. So you'll have to work hard to get there. Yeah. Okay, the 10,000 step is a good example for that. Okay, if you just do your regular walking, you're not going to get there. But it's also not impossible. So you kind of need to work harder than you would do otherwise.
Yeah. Now let's talk about how life courses develop and how they change and how people transform their lives. And I guess the first question is, do people successfully transform their lives, or are they pretty much stuck with who they are? And how do they make these decisions that are transformational?
Well, I mean, if you look at grown-ups, they're like incredibly complex, and they have all these interests and passions and whatever, and you look at like kids, and they don't have any of those. So I would say that looks like success to me in a lot of cases. They didn't just end up where they started. They ended up a lot further than they started, right? And now, of course, you could explain that in a variety of ways, right? And maybe one difference, like between the sort of psychologist approach and the philosopher's approach is, I'm inclined to say, let me think about my own case. And let me think about what kind of story I could tell about my own case that I could, so to speak, live with. So I'm not asking, well, how are people motivated, or what do people desire, or what, other people, right? Psychologists are always studying other people, like, because the data is other people, right? But I'm like, well, look, I didn't used to love philosophy. And in fact, I used to think I couldn't do it. Even when I loved it a little bit, I thought I couldn't do it, right? So I came to see things differently, but I don't see that process as something that just happened to me, like something that other people did to me. That's not the story that I tell of myself, right? Other people were relevant, but I feel like I did stuff too. Like, I put in a lot of effort, I put in a lot of work, right? My experience of myself is one in which I put in a lot of work. So as a philosopher, what I want to do is take, in a way, it's a kind of datum, right? That my experience of getting to where I am in terms of what I care about, what I value, what I desire, is that my own agency was relevant to that story, right? And so then I need a theory of what makes that possible, right? And in philosophy, there's a problem there. There's a problem about producing that theory because it looks like what it is to exercise control over yourself or make decisions for yourself is like to be rational and to think, well, look, here's what I want to be like, so let me take the steps that will get me there, right? But in these cases where you're thinking about radical life transformations, the end point, okay, is some intrinsic motivation that you don't have yet, right? That's why you want to aspire. And so why should you try to acquire that intrinsic motivation? Like take the classical music case, right? So suppose I want to become the kind of person who appreciates classical music, but suppose I don't appreciate classical music, right? Now, one weird kind of case might be, well, but I want to appear sophisticated to other people, and that's why it's ulterior motive. But that's not what we're talking about in most cases of aspiration. It's like, no, I want to actually appreciate the value of class. I think there's something out there that I'm not responding to, right? So it looks like there's a problem where I can't be rational in deciding to come to value something because the reason to value it would be the value of that thing, but I don't yet grasp that value. And so the theory that I'm trying to produce is to say, in what sense can it be a rational process or a process for which you can consider yourself responsible or a process that you can think of yourself as steering, right? In what sense can these large-scale transformative projects be you choosing and doing and deciding, given that, in effect, you don't have the relevant knowledge to make the decision rationally? So that's like the sort of paradox that I'm struggling with.
The steering and the agency, is that a model that seems compelling to you?
Yes, and so we do look at how people grow and how do you get from here to there, and I do develop a framework that enables me to study the factors that will predict how much people can grow, so how well they set their goals, how they sustain their motivation, how they gather the social support, how they manage multiple goals, and we can see that there are certain factors that will predict growth in this model. We are also less concerned with what I think you described as the self-control problem, with the idea that I want things that I don't fully realize what they are or that are in conflict with other things that I want. That's okay. Like we have a planner and a doer, as I mentioned before. I would say that also as psychologists, we care about creating the environment in which people can grow. And so say that, yes, I grew, or you look like you can grow. And what I mean by you look like you can grow is that you're in an event organized by the University of Chicago. You're probably educated, self-aware people with access to resources that enable growth. But what about others? Okay? And how can we help kids grow? How can we help people with less access to resources? There is a lot of attention in our school at the moment to questions about poverty and know how to help people with less access to resources to find ways to grow, to find ways to develop. And it's getting much more complicated when you are studying people with less access.
No.
Can I ask a question about the planner and the doer? So, because it seems to me that there's two different kinds of planning that the planner does, and I wonder whether you draw this distinction. So, like, one kind of planning that my planner does is like, okay, before, like this morning, I had to think through what are the things I have to do today, and like I'm gonna have to like prepare for this event, but I also had to write a lot of recommendation, do this, and like my planner is telling me like what order to do things, what I need to do, what I need to do in order to be able to do those things, where I need to be. Okay, that's one kind of planning my planner does, and then my doer does it, hopefully, right? But like here's another kind of planning. Like my planner decides like, I'm gonna what's the thing I got into recently? Bead. I decided I might want to get into making like bead art. Okay, like kind of stringing beads together, like bead tapestry. It doesn't really exist, but I was sort of thinking of inventing a bead tapestry thing. And I'm like, maybe I want to get into that, right? And start making bead tapestries. And my planner, right, is contemplating like, should we do this? Should we like take up this weird bead tapestry thing? And that seems really different from the case where my planner is doing the other kind of planning, right? So it kind of seems like sometimes the planner goes off the rails. And like she says things like, let's do bead tapestries, or let's have a kid, right? Like what of my, like if I think about my preferences and like what I want out of life before I have kids, right? Like my preferences are for things that are kind of selfish, and they're things like having lots of free time to myself and getting to read whenever I want to, and like not having someone attached to my body a lot of the time, and like those are my preferences. And then if I have a kid, I have like really different preferences all of a sudden, right? Mm-hmm. I'm like really concerned with this one person, and really allow them to sort of tyrannize me in ways that I would never really go in for before I'm like kind of attached to them, right? So those are cases where it seems like my planner is like kind of going nuts in terms of planning things for me that don't answer to what I already want. So from my point of view, those are really different kinds of planning.
That was a very long question. So
my question is, do you recognize that there
question?
are these two really different kinds of planning? That is, you said there's a planner and a doer, but I guess my thought is that there's a kind of planning that we do that's much harder to understand.
Okay. So when we use the metaphor of the planner and the doer, is really your long-term goals and what you end up doing. Okay, it's not planning your schedule. Okay, and then open your calendar and say, well, I'm going from this university meeting to that university meeting. Like that's not.
Yeah.
That's
the planner
the calendar.
is the one who wants to watch this serious Swedish movie, but maybe next week. Tonight we'll watch Spider-Man.
Yes. Okay. So that exactly right. So the planner is really your long-term goals. You want to be a philosopher. Okay. You want to have a child, but you haven't met the person to do it with yet. Okay? Like that's things that you can set as life goals. Okay. This is what I want to do.
Yeah.
Okay? But not quite a plan.
Just say your slightly different accounts of how life progresses resonate with me on one level. On my career level, where it's a little stressing, I just getting out a little ahead of myself, trying to write a little better, trying to aspire to be a better writer. I should read this stuff so I could do this a little better. And so that's a sort of linear progression. And in my case, it happens to be a very boring linear progression. My career is a completely straight line. But in my internal life, it's not like that at all. And so my internal life, I had bad things happen to me. I had a shitty few years. I suffered in a way I'd never suffered before. I experienced depth to myself I'd never experienced and was unaware of before. I listened to a lot of sad Irish music. And out of that experience came a response, and that completely changed who I was. And so I had an interview with one extremely emotionally intelligent interviewer 5 years ago, and then I had one about 6 months ago. And afterwards, she said, I've never seen anybody change so much. And it wasn't because it was some plan or it wasn't some aspiration. It was bad things happened. And there was a certain way of responding to those bad things in a way that was open breaking. And so how does that experience, which I think most people have gone through some valley in their lives, which they say is the transformational moment of their life. And it's more a response than an action.
Yeah, so definitely transformation doesn't happen just as a result of setting a goal. Okay, life happens, right? And things happen that we didn't plan, and they change our goals, and we might start to like sad Irish music. Like that, things happen and we respond to them. That's a different process than setting a goal and going there. Okay? People learn from these setbacks. We find that surprisingly little. Okay? So there is much more information in failures than what people realize. There is often not so much learning. By the way, it could be that we so much emphasize that people should learn from failure exactly because they don't do it. It's like you guys emphasizing that you should eat broccoli because you don't do it. So it's nice when there is learning from setbacks. It not something that we ever assume will happen. And we respond to life. And actually, when I was reading your stuff, Agnes, I had the same thought that it sounds like people have a real clear way where they are going, and what about just stumbling upon something? Okay, I just took a class in philosophy and found it interesting. I never planned to be a philosopher like that. Your thinking was, or at least your writing to me sounded like I already have a plan to become a philosopher at the point where I'm taking my first philosophy class. And that's not how we think people happen. At least as a social psychologist, we believe people are responding to the situation. It's what happens in life.
How did you become a psychologist?
By mistake. I tried a few other things. I didn't want to be a political scientist. I didn't want to be a sociologist. I was trying for 1 week to be an economist. That wasn't fun. And here I am, a psychologist. Stuck.
So I think that my picture's a lot closer to the stumbling picture maybe than I sometimes make it sound. It's like this. It depends on whether you're looking at that initial stumbly moment from the point of view of being at that moment or retrospectively, right? And retrospectively, we can often see a lot more in that moment than we could see at the time. And we're like, oh, that's when I was first starting to get the inkling that. But like at the time, you couldn't articulate the inkling very well. But later you can. So I guess my thought is I agree with you that we do there are all kinds of accidents and external circumstances that figure in how we end up where we end up, right? But there's also the thing that you said that really struck me was the response, right? So it wasn't just that bad stuff happened to you. That's not the explanation of what the result, right? Bad stuff happened to you and you responded in a particular way. And presumably the response wasn't purely dictated by the nature of the bad stuff, because if it had been, you wouldn't have even had to mention the response, right? So I think that that case is actually not very different from the other kinds of cases that we're thinking of. The way in which it's different is that there are some experiences that are easy to discuss in front of people. You can telegraph the whole experience very quickly, like efficiently. So like having a child or a career or whatever, because there's like a typology to it, right? But a lot of the really significant stuff that happens to a lot of really significant value changes in our lives are really idiosyncratic. So it's like hard to tell the story of it. It would take a long time. You need to read a novel or something. But I think what happens in a situation like that where a bunch of bad stuff happens to you, what happens is that your sort of value framework gets shaken up. And a lot of that value framework was internalized from your society and people around you, right? And what you're forced to do is be like, wait, what do I want out of life? And what is it for my life to have meaning, right? And you have to, in some sense, now construct a new target that is a little bit more the product of your own agency and way of seeing things, because your old target that was to some degree inherited doesn't work anymore, right? And I think of that as paradigmatically aspirational, but it's aspiration that if we want to get a kind of concrete grip on it, we're often going to want to do something like read literature rather than philosophy, just because it would take so much time to spell out the case, if you see what I mean. So I think of that as a case of aspiration.
Okay. We're just a few more minutes before we throw the questions to the floor. We're at a business school. Austin could correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to me for a while when I was a student here, and one of my mentors was Milton Friedman, that the economists took utility for granted. Like it's a black box they call utility, and people are motivated by this thing called utility, this thing called self-interest. But they didn't say, well, what is actually that thing? They just thought people are motivated by self-interest. And how do you think about, you're actually at the business school, how do you think about the classical motivation that people are interested in by the desire for money, status, and power?
Yeah, so first, I've been in the business school for a while, and I never got the note about what I'm supposed to believe in. So they don't tell us that you believe in power and money when they hire us. We totally reject that. Well, I would say that you can explain a lot of humans' behavior with simple motives such as resources and power. saying that that there are no exceptions will be wrong. Okay? Incentives can backfire. Many people desire power, and some don't, and sometimes looking for power may lead you to something that you did not intend to look for. We do look at the black box. Okay?
Yeah.
We do look at how people respond to incentives. We look at when incentives backfire. So, I keep going back to the broccoli, but that's an example for incentives that backfire, and we study that, and we study when it's good to give external incentives versus to encourage the person to find their internal incentives. So do it because it's interesting for you, because it's fulfilling. Don't worry about what you can get out of it. We think a lot about the black box, and I mean, I don't know if I really answer the question, but it's not. I don't think that this all like the traditional perception of economics characterizes how many of us.
Yeah, well, I think that's what's exciting about this moment. People are now looking in the black box.
So that has really changed. I do think, like, when I see the tension between the approaches is that we are much more into looking how people respond to their environment. So that the whole notion of agency is often kind of a decoration. It's not really the thing. It was interesting. So when Agnes and I met for the first time, we talked about the book My Brilliant Friend. Okay, which Agnes teaches a class on that. So she knows much more. But I read that book. I read all four. I loved it. Okay? And I thought that this is all about the situation, how people get stuck in the situation, and how their situation doesn't allow them to do certain things that they would like to do, that prevents them from growing. So for me, as a social psychologist, that was a story about the situation. Agnes can say what it's for her, but it's nothing about that.
Yeah, well, so I read it as a story of, like, these two girls who grow up sort of in this impoverished, sexist environment with, like, very few options before them, and, like, one of them learns computer programming, the other becomes a novelist. Like, so from my point of view, it's this amazing transformation of they didn't, and they both feared ending up like their mothers, and they didn't, in fact. But there are a whole bunch of ways in which they are still constrained. So I want to grant that. I think that maybe instead of saying, like, oh, there's something that you should care about besides utility and money, status, and power, one thing you might think about as a philosopher is that's actually kind of hard to see why people care about status. So it's already, like, in terms of utility, right? Status is a little mysterious. In fact, I'm just going to indulge myself for a second because maybe not a lot of people know that Shadi was once my Greek teacher. So I'm going to make a point about Greek. So this is something that I thought was a really cool fact about, there's this Greek word doxa, which means, like, opinion, right? So, like, my opinion about you, like, what I think about you, that's my doxa, right? Okay, but if you look it up in the Greek dictionary, you'll find that meaning, and you'll also find the meaning reputation. So that's also what the word doxa means. And for a while, I'm like, oh, it has these two meanings, opinion, reputation. Because those are two totally different words. In English, you look those words up in the dictionary, they mean different things, right? But I realized one day that actually it's not two different meanings because my reputation is your opinion about me, right? So opinion and reputation, in a way, are two sides of a coin, right? There's what I think about you, and then I can represent. My reputation is in you. It's something in you. It's something external to me. Right? That was really cool that Greek, like, grasps that and just uses one word for the two things. Okay, but the fact that you've used one word for the two things doesn't mean you've actually explained how someone goes from caring about the thing that's in their head to caring about the thing that's in someone else's head, right? And so the fact that I can care about status, that means things that are in other people's heads matter to me. Right? And the process of how we go from, in some sense, a really narrow sense of utility to a sense of utility that includes investment in the minds of others is already, in a way, blows open any kind of super narrow theory of self-interest.
Okay. Let's go to the floor. I think there are going to be some microphones floating around. And all that I ask is that you make your question very Chicago-like, long, highly intellectualized with no question at the end. Well, the first thing, one of the things teachers know is that when sometimes they pour into students more than the students are willing or able to receive, because life hasn't happened yet. And so my professors poured Nietzsche and Kant and Hegel and Thucydides into me, but you don't really know what Thucydides is talking about until you've experienced some things. And then I guess what has changed is I've gone, I don't want to make this about me, but that is how I make a living. You know, when you go through a bad period, I read a guy named Henry Nouwen said, when you're going through pain, you have to stay in the pain to see what it has to teach you. And I was like, screw that. I want to get out of the pain. But when you do go in the pain, you discover an emotional language that maybe it's just me. I think it's a lot of guys who are not emotionally transparent. And back in the day, University of Chicago didn't exactly help with that. And so then suddenly when you read St. Augustine and the depths of emotion that he feels, it suddenly becomes a real thing for you. And then you know, in a very schematic way, the desires of your heart to be in fusion with one another and the desires of the soul to serve some uplifting good become much more germane and salient. And I wrote a whole book about this, and I don't want to go into it. But it's not like, it wasn't actually getting more agency, it was losing agency. I was in a self-sufficient life where I had tons of agency over my life. And surrendering agency meant entering into much deeper relationships with people around me. And I was and the way I did it is I threw myself into all these emotional circumstances that were completely uncomfortable. And so 2 weeks ago, I was at some touchy-feely conference, and we had to pick the guy next to us and sing a song into each other's eyes. And 10 years ago, I would have shot myself. I could not have done that. But you get to a point where you harden you soften some of the thick soil, the crusty soil you've built on top of yourself through life. And so it feels more like a going deeper into yourself rather than a shifting from being one thing to another thing.
I guess I'll start. So I think that there are going to be just facts about you that are like, well, you're born with those traits or whatever that are relevant to what you can come to appreciate. I've really tried with classical music over many, many years. My mother tried. Like, it's not seem to be working, right? That doesn't seem to be where I'm heading aspirationally. Okay, so so you might say that there are these kind of let's just call that nature, right? So there are these natural facts, and there's nurture, right? If we want to just restrict nurture for a moment to like what other people do to you and what your environment does to you, right? So I think both of those are relevant to aspiration, but that is not the whole story. That is it's not the case that the whole story of how you become who you are is some kind of sum of like who you were to start out with and then what other people do to you. And I guess what I want to say is that there's something else, which is a kind of work that you put in to get things into view. And I'm calling that agency, but I think maybe, you know, it's not the kind of agency manifest in kind of like decisions about planning, right? So maybe my thought here is that agency is quite a lot broader than we sometimes give it credit for, and sometimes like allowing yourself to feel certain things and putting yourself in an environment where you feel certain things and thinking you have to learn from that. That's a kind of agency too, right? And that's a kind of taking the reins of your life in the sense that you're not simply allowing your life to fill the pattern that it had been going in. So I guess my thought is like, yes, there is the inner stuff and the outer stuff, but then there's just another variable in there, which is very important and which we tend to overlook. We tend to want to tell a story in which either there was a secret philosopher buried in me from the beginning or the world made me into a philosopher. And I guess what I want to say is like that doesn't resonate with my experience.
Can I add to it? So you are making the distinction between nature and nurture, and as a social psychologist, I would like to encourage you to drop personality, drop nurture, okay? Use just nature, and this is not by denying that there are differences between people. You probably have more musical talent than other people in this room, and that's nice to have. However, there is very little that we can do with this. So we are who we are, okay? We have our personality. We are, more or less smart, more or less musical, whatever. It doesn't matter, okay? If we can just ignore that and just look at the environment and look at what kind of experiences we can get, what kind of learning we can have, there is much more that we can do with that, okay? We can grow through experiences. Saying I'm the type of person that can grow, that's just not very useful. I have many years of practice explaining people's behavior without using their personality. I would like to encourage you to just try it for a while. It really opens your mind to think about interventions for others and for yourself that help you grow. So I think the question was whether philosophers need to have some hands-on knowledge. So
Yeah, okay. I'll
you
take
are
that
the one
question.
to take that.
So I'll tell you about some things that I'm working on right now. So I'm writing something for the New Yorker called The Ethics of Breakup, in which I'm trying to argue that there is in fact ethical rules to how you break up with someone, and that just walk away is not okay usually. And that's I take that to be an important philosophical question that we have not really asked ourselves, in the sense that we have this thing all's fair in love and war, and nobody thinks that about war anymore, but a lot of people still think it about love, actually. So I have embodied knowledge about this particular question. And in fact, it's my own experiences with breakups, and particularly a breakup with a close friend, that forced me to ask this question, where 17 years after this breakup, I'm still upset about it, and I'm like, wow, something really went wrong there. And me saying to her, I just don't want to be friends with you anymore, maybe that was really not okay, and that's why I'm still upset about it. And I think that is why I'm still upset about it. It wasn't okay. So there's an example. For me, a lot of I have this paper, The Reason to Be Angry Forever, and it came from the fact that I was really angry with someone for a really, really long time, and I wanted to understand, why am I so angry? And I realized it was really logical for me to be so angry. In fact, it's what I argue in the paper, right? So I actually kind of agree with you that a lot of the time philosophers don't consult their own experience in guiding themselves towards questions. I just wrote something about miscarriage and abortion. And not abortion from is it right or wrong, but what is it like to contemplate having an abortion, which I did. I think these are important philosophical questions, but I think there are a lot of questions like that that just have not really gotten aired in philosophy. Because there's a little bit too much of a tendency to inherit our questions. And part of that is we have such awesome people to inherit them from. People like Augustine and Plato and Aristotle, but they're all men. So they ask a particular set of questions. There's a lot of questions they didn't ask. And so, I think it is really important to consult our experience, because there might be a lot of other questions that we need to be asking that we forgot to ask.
I'll take a quick stab because I think about this a lot. So Nietzsche has an answer for us here. He said, find the most beautiful things in your childhood and see if you can draw a thematic line through them. And if you can do that, then you'll find the law of your very nature. But the emphasis is on aesthetics, is that we are called to certain things we find extremely beautiful. And that beauty tends to last. There was a painter who was asked, why are you a painter? And she said, I love the smell of paint. It's just the aesthetic enjoyment of that sense of paint. Or else, and that sometimes it settles into a daemon, a problem we're all trying to solve. I ran across a psychologist, you might know his name. He wrote a book called The Orchid and the Dandelion. He's somewhere out in California named Tom something. And his basic theory is that some kids are orchids. If they're put in the right soil, they bloom and they're tremendous. If they're put in bad soil, they really struggle. Some kids are dandelions. And you can put them in any soil, they'll be fine. And I've always been fascinated by this thesis, and I got to meet him. And I said, how do you start on this? He said, well, I had a sister. And my sister was more brilliant, more beautiful, had a greater personality. And I've had this great career. She suffered from major depressions, got a PhD at MIT, but suffered from major depressions and killed herself at 42. And so his whole research career has been based on this distinction between him and his sister, trying to figure that out. And some people are haunted by one thing that's either very beautiful or very hurtful to them. And once they nab on that thing, they never quite let it go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so after that, I'll just have to be much more practical. You developed your intrinsic motivation by trying out things, by exposing yourself, by having new experiences. This is another place where I think that we have similar views, that just like trying out many new things is a way to grow, okay, is a way to collect experiences. Also, intrinsic motivation is really the feeling that what you are doing is rewarding as you are doing it, and many things will only become rewarding once you are doing them for a while. Okay, it's hard to think about something that you are doing for the first time that requires any effort and that is immediately rewarding. Okay, so it's over the experience of doing something that you develop the passion for it, and then it takes you, okay, and then it carries you on. So keep exploring.
I'll say one thing, which is that I didn't use the word, but when I was distinguishing between advice and mentorship, I think the crucial relationship that allows one person to help another is trust. That's interpersonal trust. You're in a way referring to intrapersonal trust, like trusting yourself, right? And I would say there, the place where that would show up for me is that if you think of the difference between an aspirant, so someone who's trying to come to value something new, versus someone who's succeeded at the end of that process, the person who's trying, there will be lots of trust and fear because they wouldn't already know that it was going to work out, right? So some of that problem of, like, for me, that I'm dealing with philosophically, of how can it be rational to try to get yourself to value something new, is the sort of compromised rationality of that process is a matter of these kind of emotional reactions. Of having trust and fear instead of something else, which is better than trust and fear, right? It's better when you reach the end point. So trust and fear are the compromise case, or the case that shows that you're still on your way.
From a psychological point of view, we didn't talk about resources. And the way you talk about trust is a resource. Okay, and now let's think about what are the resources that we bring into our pursuits. Okay. Well, it might be material resources. Okay, I can afford it. It might be that I have the social network. Okay, I have other people that can support me. I have other people that will enable me to get out of these difficult situations. And it might be what you call trust, and I would actually call confidence, because I reserve trust, maybe you meant that, I reserve trust more to trust in other people, trust that they will help me, that they will be there for me, and then there is the confidence in myself, which is the trust in myself that I will be okay. And that's a major resources. It's actually also the main predictor of how much people can learn from negative feedback. And what you're describing are extreme examples of getting negative feedback, of failing, and confident people who trust themselves, can better learn from that.
Okay, I think we should wrap it up there. I once based a book on a distinction between the resume and the eulogy virtues. And the resume, the things that make you good at your job. The eulogy are the things that people say after you're dead, whether you're courageous, capable of great love, self-understanding, aspiration. And even in the belly of the resume, I think we've brought a little eulogy. So I thank you for a splendid conversation.
Thank you.